A very warm welcome indeed to you all to St. Mary Le Bow tonight. Evangelistic contortions in the present church sometimes lead to some curious propositions, but on the whole, government is generally worse. I cannot be the only person who finds the government's vaunted claim so to reconfigure the NHS that 500,000 lives will be saved conceptually difficult. Saved from what? A sudden moment of acute crisis? From the onset of some disease to which the individuals may in fact be predisposed? From the dangers of intervention and infection? Is the measure longevity, mobility, or sanity? How, in short, will we know if we are one of the happy 500,000? By contrast, the Astronomer Royal's recent reported assertion that the predicted lifespan of the Earth is only halfway through, that evolution is in progress and that life may evolve beyond humanity, this assertion, by contrast, is refreshingly precise. Christian theology might find it easier to debate with Professor the Lord Reiss and his vista for human living and risk than with the government's rather nebulous notion of saving life. In a world in which, as also Reiss opines, technology moves faster than culture, a lecture entitled Science, Religion and Ethics promises much. This modern series of lectures named for Robert Boyle and the inspiration of his legacy is 15 years old tonight. And as a careful reading of invitations and publicity will have revealed, it marks a collaboration with the International Society of Science and Religion. More of that anon. That tonight's lecturer, Michael Reiss, is the present president of ISSR, cements the alliance. Less tellingly, tonight's responder, Janet Soskice, taught me doctrine 30-odd years ago. Whilst this may not be a recommendation, it should perhaps not be held against her. The new collaboration has been occasioned, and with both energy and appropriateness, by the decision of Dr. Michael Byrne of this parish to lay aside the burdens of coordination and management. In the city, I've always been advised that thanks should be laid on with a trowel. Every dinner is the best dinner eaten, every wine the most incomparable and memorable, every speech the wittiest. But in embracing the task of thanking Michael tonight, I want to eschew that tradition with wonted sincerity. It is a fine thing when someone who has invented, sustained, and enabled a project to see it placed in the hands of others and to be confident that its objects will be defended and advanced. Michael has not only brought this series to high maturity, but has shown exceptional graciousness and purpose in handing it on. Not for nothing do the parish wags occasionally denote this as the Boyle Lecture. We are very much in his debt. Other elements of the lectures remain in place, notably the energy and interest of the advisory board, chaired by Lord Corkin-Orrery, the head of the Boyle family, together with the imaginative and generous support of neighbourly livery companies, the Mercers and the Grocers. None of this do we, as a parish, take for granted. Tonight's proceedings will appear in text and video on the ISSR website and on the parishes as soon as possible, and there is a copy of the lecture and the response for you as you leave tonight. To introduce ISSR and tonight's lecturer and responder, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Fraser Watts, a past president of the Society.
Thank you, George. It's a great pleasure to be introducing tonight's lecturer. I do so on behalf of the International Society for Science and Religion as past president and now executive secretary. And we're pleased and proud in ISSR to take on the sponsorship of this prestigious series of Boyle Lectures on Science and Religion. The society was formed in 2002, and the intention was partly to bring together the brightest and best in science and religion to form an elite academy to give leadership to the field. It was also very deliberately an international society, which implies that it's also a multi-faith society. Christianity has played a leading role in discussions about the relationship between science and religion. The Boyle Lectures, which began in 1692, are a marker of that. But religion is a global phenomenon, and an international society for science and religion has to be a multi-faith society. It's no accident that ISSR began a year after the destruction of the Twin Towers in Manhattan. That showed how important relations between people of different faith traditions are to the future of humanity. The dialogue with science tends to bring out the most rational side of religion, and it was felt by some of those who founded ISSR that if the dialogue with science was encouraged among members of all faith traditions, it might not only help them to get on better with science, but also help them to get on better with each other. In that sense, ISSR is part of a reconciliation project, one that is perhaps more urgent now than it was in 1692. As this is the first Boyle Lecture to be convened by ISSR, it's fitting that the Boyle Lecture this evening should be the current president of ISSR, Professor Michael J. Reiss, Professor of Science Education at the UCL Institute of Education. He would have been a worthy Boyle Lecturer at any time, but it happily cements the connection between ISSR and these Boyle Lecturers for him to be the lecturer this evening. Michael is a biologist, educator, ethicist, and priest. He began his academic career as a biologist studying animal behavior. He then spent a period at the coalface of biology teaching in classrooms before moving into academia, working on science education. As a biologist and Anglican priest, it's natural for him to have taken an interest in science and religion. And for Michael, that's taken two main forms. One has focused on the interface between science education and religion. For example, how to handle questions about religion that may be raised in the context of science teaching in the classroom, and whether the way in which science is presented in the classroom affects people's perceptions of the relationship between science and religion. He's also been interested in how science and religion address ethical issues, the subject on which he will speak tonight. But I'll leave him to address that himself. It's a great personal pleasure for me to introduce Michael Reiss this evening. We've known each other for about 30 years, and we're ordained as Anglican priests together in the same ordination service. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we've worked very closely together in ISSR, and that has simply enhanced the high regard in which I already held him. It's also a pleasure to introduce Professor Janet Soskice to respond to tonight's lecture. I've also known Janet for about 30 years, and like George, was taught by her, not Christian doctrine, but sex and gender, if I remember. Janet is Professor Emeritus of Philosophical Theology at the University of Cambridge and has made important contributions to the dialogue between science and religion, most notably on the role of metaphor. Tonight's lecture takes the dialogue between science and religion in a more applied direction than some previous Boyle lectures. I personally welcome that. It's now clear that it's perfectly possible for science and religion to work constructively together. Having proved that is possible, it's perhaps now time for them to team up, to bring their respective contributions to bear on challenges that matter to us all. So it's not just a duty and privilege, but also a very personal pleasure to invite Professor Michael J. Reiss to give this year's Boyle Lecture on Science, Religion, and Ethics. Thank you.
Science, religion, and ethics. So just to give an overview initially, how do we and how should we decide what is morally right and what is morally wrong? Now, for most of human history, for many, the teachings of religion were presumed to be either the or a principal answer. Over time, two developments challenged this. The first was the establishment of the discipline of moral philosophy, and foundational texts in the West, such as Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and the growth of coherent non-religious approaches to ethics, notably utilitarianism, served to marginalize the role of religion. And then secondly, more recently, in the 20th century, there was the rapid growth of evolutionary biology with an enthusiastic presumption among some that biology is the source of ethics. So what I'm going to try and do is say a bit about these various fields and then ask what might the role of religion still be. So I'm going to start with a section on ethics. Ethics, I think, as we would probably all accept and know, is the branch of philosophy concerned with how we decide what is morally wrong and what is morally right. And all of us have to make moral decisions daily about what is the right thing to do. Should I continue to talk to somebody for their benefit or make my excuse and leave to do something I would rather? Should I give money to animal charities or to medical charities? Should I give more weight to my interests than to those of others when choosing for whom to vote in an election? Now, each of us may give much thought or no thought to these sorts of questions. Ethics, though, insofar as it's either useful or possible to make a distinction between ethics and morals, ethics is a specific discipline that tries to probe the reasoning behind our moral life. And it does this by critically examining and analyzing the thinking which is or could be used to justify our moral choices and our actions in particular situations. Ethics is therefore a practice, but it's also, just as other intellectual disciplines like science, mathematics, and history are, it's also a branch of knowledge. And ethical thinking is not wholly distinct from thinking in other disciplines, but it cannot simply be reduced to them. Now, ethical conclusions can't be proved unambiguously in the way that, roughly speaking, for example, mathematical theorems can, but this does not mean that all ethical conclusions are equally valid. Some are more likely to be valid than others. And I think I can assert that one can be most confident about the validity of an ethical conclusion if three criteria are met. First, if the answer that one arrives at is convincingly supported by reason. Secondly, if the ethical arguments take place within a well-established ethical framework. And thirdly, if a reasonable degree of consensus exists about the validity of the conclusions, and that needs to arise from a process of genuine debate. Now, it might be hoped or supposed that reason alone is enough for one to be confident about an ethical conclusion. But there are problems in relying on reason alone when thinking ethically. The main one being that there is still not a single universally accepted framework within which ethical questions can be decided by reason. Indeed, it's unlikely that such a framework will exist in the foreseeable future, if ever. This is not to say that reason is unnecessary, but just to assert that it's insufficient. So, classically, as many of you will be very familiar with, reason cannot decide between an ethical system which looks only at the consequences of actions and one which considers whether certain actions are right or wrong in themselves, whatever their consequences. And for that reason, much of ethics still boils down to views about right and wrong that are informed more about what seems reasonable in the everyday sense of the term than what follows from formal reasoning. Now, when I, with a background in mathematics and the natural sciences, first started reading books on ethics, I was surprised at how often appeals to intuition were used. Indeed, when reading about trolley problems, intuition not infrequently appears as a trump card. If you're not familiar with trolley problems are difficulties faced on a daily basis by professional ethicists when they regularly are forced into situations whether they have to decide to allow a heavy trolley to continue along a track, mowing down 5 people in the original classic formulation, or by pulling a lever, divert the trolley so that merely one unsuspecting person is killed and the other 5 are saved. You then find, as an ethicist, if you solve this problem, you're regularly faced immediately by a whole string of further problems involving pushing very heavy people in front of moving trolleys and things like this. But I mean this quite seriously. When I started reading these, I found it fascinating because the answer usually does require appeals to intuition. Now, as a mathematician and as a scientist, appeals to intuition are not usually considered to be of much worth, of no worth whatsoever. You wouldn't get very far in quantum theory, for example, if one relied on intuition. Now, indeed, anybody with a background in evolutionary biology, such as I have, will be rather suspicious about intuition as a means of arriving at truth. Intuition is one of the ways in which humans make decisions, and unsurprisingly, having been honed by millions of years of natural selection, it's pretty effective. But we always need to remember that natural selection is, roughly speaking, and I shall have more to say about this shortly, natural selection is, roughly speaking, all about leaving copies of oneself in future generations. The emphasis is on survival and reproduction, not on truth. So to give one classic well-known instance of this in the field, if all's going reasonably well with my speaking in the microphone, you can hear me speaking words punctuated by gaps between the words. But in fact, a high-quality audio recording shows that many of the gaps between the words that I speak are just as noisy as some of the words, unless I pause for too long. What your minds have evolved and developed to be able to do is to break up the stream of waves that my voice is producing so that it is intelligible. And this is what one does all the time in perception as well, for example. So to give just one example from vision, we are all of us much more sensitive to movement than we are to things being stationary. And the evolutionary advantage to this is, I think, pretty clear. Mothers need to be sensitive to where their offspring are and if they change position, and of all of us need to be aware of possible predators moving towards us. Indeed, we share this hypersensitivity to movement with most other organisms. The classic work was done over 60 years ago on frogs. This is an illustration of the fact that it's not only humans that sense only part of the world and emphasize other parts. we really do construct the world that is around us. The simplest way of summarizing all this so far is to say that the external world is a complex world, and even the human mind, in all its richness and complexity, simply has neither the capacity nor the need to develop a full detailed map of it. Rather, we have evolved to get through life and leave offspring that have an above average chance of doing the same. Now, often truth and evolutionary success go hand in hand. There is little to be gained in under or overestimating the nutritional value in different foods, for example. However, even here, the fact that today's environment for most of us is so different from that in which we spent much of our evolutionary history causes problems. As is well known, many people have a greater liking for sugars and for saturated fats than is good for them, and this can cause problems for those of us who now live with a superabundance of such foods. In the past, of course, there was little to be gained and much to be risked in not stuffing ourselves whenever an occasional glut of such foods presented themselves. Now, back to ethical frameworks. Traditionally, the ethical frameworks most widely accepted in most cultures arose within systems of religious belief. So if we consider, for example, the question, is it wrong to lie? And if so, why? There was a time when many people in many countries would have accepted the answer, yes, it is wrong, lying is forbidden by Scripture. Nowadays, of course, not everyone accepts Scripture as a source of authority, and also, while the world Scriptures have a lot to say about things like telling the truth, sexual ethics, property, they don't have much to say about many of the ethical problems that are faced in today's technological societies. A further issue is that most of us are more aware nowadays that we live in a multicultural or pluralist society. There is, therefore, in most countries no longer a shared set of moral values. Nevertheless, there is great value in taking seriously the various traditions, religious and otherwise, that have given rise to ethical conclusions. People do not live their lives in ethical isolation. We all grow up in particular moral traditions. Even if we end up departing somewhat from the values we received from our families and those around us, none of us derives our moral beliefs from first principles, ex nihilo, as it were. So how should we decide what is morally right and what is morally wrong? Well, the simplest, as I hinted earlier, is to look at what the consequences of actions are. But the deeper question is whether that's all we need to do. Are there certain actions that are morally required, such as telling the truth, whatever their consequences? Now, consequentialists, and particularly utilitarians, think that the answer is that all we need to do is to look at the consequences. And utilitarianism, as many of you will know, arose at a time in Britain at the end of the 18th century under people like Bentham and J.S. Mill, as religion was beginning to wane in influence. There are strengths, there are weaknesses in any ethical framework, but one of the things I particularly like about utilitarianism is that it provides a single ethical framework within which, in principle, any moral question may be answered. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about the legalization of cannabis, the age of sexual consent, or the use of animals in school dissection. A utilitarian perspective exists. The other good thing about utilitarianism is it takes pleasure and happiness seriously. The general public may sometimes suspect that ethics is all about telling people what not to do. Utilitarians proclaim the positive message that people should simply do what maximizes the total amount of pleasure in the world. Now, there are, as I said, arguments for and against utilitarianism, but let me just mention a different competing framework. This is one that certain things are right or wrong in themselves, irrespective of the consequences. So a very classic example is whether or not capital punishment is acceptable. So some people, if they're utilitarians, by the way, to answer whether capital punishment is acceptable, you need to set up a commission. You need to collect large amounts of data. You need to look at countries that do have capital punishment and countries that don't, and see the consequences for things like reoffending rates, general levels of fear in the population, probably the total amount of money spent on lifers, and so on. But somebody who reasons intrinsically might just say, I don't care, I just don't think we should take other people's lives in those sort of situations, full stop. Equally, somebody else might argue intrinsically, capital punishment is the right way to proceed for certain crimes, such as first-degree murder. So, a different ethical framework. Now, there are a number of these possible intrinsic frameworks, and perhaps the most widely discussed are those of autonomy and justice. Now, considerable disagreement exists about what each of these mean precisely, but they're both powerful arguments. And some of you will know that Kant, in his groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, which I also mentioned earlier, argued that the fundamental way to decide these sorts of things is we should act only according to that maxim whereby we can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law. That's the way these people tended to write in those days. What this roughly means is we should never do things which favor us merely because we are us. So this forbids such things as theft and telling lies. It is, of course, close to the golden rule that we should treat others as we would like to be treated if we were them. In another language, we are called to love our neighbors as ourselves. And the last thing I want to mention in this passage about ethics is that a rather different approach is provided by virtue ethics, where instead of starting from particular actions and trying to decide whether they fail to maximize the amount of happiness in the world, are divinely forbidden, or infringe somebody's rights, they focus on the moral characteristics of good people. So if we think, for example, of what we might want in a good teacher, some of those things are skills, knowing their subject, ability to communicate it, keeping order in a classroom or a lecture theatre, etc. But some of what most of us probably also want, as parents or otherwise from good teachers, are people who are good individuals. For example, ones who have a natural disposition to treat all students equally and fairly. So that's part of being a virtuous person. In this particular case, a virtuous teacher. Now, virtue ethics has an ancient pedigree, and as many of you will know, it's undergone something of a reinvention the last 30 or 40 years. And part of the reason for its rediscovery is that there had become a quite instrumental tendency for the training of people in many professions, such as medicine and the law, accountants, and so on. And in those instrumental approaches to training, the notion of moral goodness appears little or not at all. And yet many people want such professionals, people, I mean as patients or clients, to be good people. We want doctors, lawyers, nurses, and accountants to genuinely believe in things like justice. And indeed, when there are occasional examples of people in professions such as those behaving very badly, Harold Shipman is always held up as one of the most extreme cases, people don't get deeply hurt or upset, or hundreds of people lose their lives because of a failure of skill. It's to do with something that has gone wrong with the person as a person. They are not acting virtuously. Now, I want now to say something about evolutionary ethics. My background, as I said, is in evolutionary biology. And one of the great triumphs of the last 150 years has been for us to realize how the theory of natural selection, as first brought into prominence by Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace, can explain so much of the natural world. Darwin realized that this was true of human behavior as much as of non-human behavior. So his The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex, and his The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals explore the ramifications of natural selection for human behaviors and emotions. Now, even though Darwin knew nothing about the mechanism of inheritance, he realized, for example, which is just one of the many examples of what a genius he was, he realized that natural selection might be responsible for the evolution of worker sterility in the social insects. So this is where, as you know, basically the workers in social bees and ants and wasps, they don't have offspring themselves. They don't breed. Now, at first sight, it might be thought this is a pretty crushing blow for natural selection. How can it be functional for many individuals, indeed the great majority of individuals in these colonies, to be sterile? Darwin argued that sterility in such circumstances might evolve by a process which he termed family selection and is nowadays generally known as kin selection. So to quote Darwin, breeders of cattle wish the flesh and fat to be well marbled. This is a particular way you may or may not enjoy your meat if you're a meat eater, but stay with me. The animal has been slaughtered, so in other words, you only find out which bullock tasted great after it's dead. That's kind of key to the whole point of eating food. But the breeder goes with confidence to the same family. In other words, traits can be passed on not just via offspring, but via nieces, nephews, and indeed to a more attenuated degree, more distant relatives. Darwin's thoughts about altruism largely lay dormant for a century until a PhD student named William D. Hamilton produced a more general mathematical theory that encapsulated Darwin's insights about the origins of altruism. And advances came thick and fast. So the 1960s and 1970s, as some of you here know extremely well, saw an explosion in fieldwork in behavioral ecology and sociobiology and associated mathematical modeling. Now, as is often the case in the history of science when a new discipline arises, with hindsight, we can see that some of those working in the field may have overstretched themselves. So the work of Richard Dawkins, E.O. Wilson, and others, particularly when extrapolations were made to human behavior, had to be tempered by the work of people like Stephen Jay Gould, Richard Lewontin, Stephen Rose, and others. And there are still areas of disagreement. But within this, a sub-discipline of evolutionary ethics arose. Now, evolutionary ethics has proven to be extremely controversial. I've already briefly referred to Darwin's insights into explanations for worker sterility in the social insects. Let me just say the three ways in which altruism is thought to arise usually, which are not particularly controversial. One of which I've already mentioned, kin selection. Another one of which is basically when unrelated individuals give you help and you give them subsequent help. So this is a sort of reciprocal relationship and is called reciprocal altruism. And there are now loads of examples known in the animal world. But there is also a process which is much less familiar and falls outside these two categories. And let me just tell you about one of them called meiotic drive. Examples are known from a number of species where one or more of the genes in a genome, in the genetic material, manage to manipulate the process of meiotic cell division, that's the sort of cell division that leads to gametes, and get themselves overrepresented in the next generation to the harm of the other cells in the individual in which they are. So this is an example where Richard Dawkins' gene-eye view of life is thought by the vast majority of academic biologists to be absolutely correct. It's an example where there is disagreement within individuals about what is best for each of the cells within the individuals. Now, as I said, evolutionary ethics is controversial. Let me give me one example where it overstretched itself. Back in the year 2000, there was a furore when an evolutionary biologist called Randy Thornhill, it's a rather apposite term that one should never joke about people's first names, and his co-author and anthropologist Craig Palmer co-authored a book called A Natural History of Rape. They argued, in part from analogous behaviors in a number of non-human species, that rape arises for evolutionary reasons and is sexually motivated. And the book received mixed reviews, and I'm glad to say some of the most negative ones came from male evolutionary biologists. So, for example, the primatologist Francis de Waal started by saying, rape is sexual violence. There is no doubt in my mind that people who try to reduce rape to either sex or violence miss its complexity, and went on to make a number of academic objections to the argument. Now, let me tell you about a philosopher called Peter Singer, who did argue about the importance of human rationality in our ethical thinking. And this is a book he produced called The Expanding Circle. And what Singer did was to argue that altruism began historically in humans as a drive to protect one's own kin, so mainly offspring, but could be other relatives. And this is a crucial point. But then over time, as our brains became larger, it developed into a consciously chosen ethic. So what began as pure evolutionary biology developed into something more than this. And I happen to think that Singer's argument is completely correct, and there are lots of other areas of human thought and endeavor where this is the case. So there are probably biological explanations, for example, for the origins of music, of dance, of language, of religion, and of mathematics. But one needs far more than biology to understand the Brandenburg Concertos, the Rite of Spring, Ulysses, the doctrine of the Trinity, or the proof of Fermat's last theorem. Now, let me tell you one worry about evolutionary ethics. That is that other species have very different rules about what is appropriate behavior. Again, Darwin got early on to the essence of the issue, so quite a long quotation from Darwin. I do not wish to maintain that any strictly social animal, if its intellectual faculties were to become as active and as highly developed as in man, would acquire exactly the same moral sense as ours. In the same manner as various animals have some sense of beauty, though they admire widely different objects, so they might have a sense of right and wrong, though led by it to follow widely different lines of conduct. If, for example, to take an extreme case, men were reared under precisely the same conditions as hive bees, so things like honeybees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. Now, I have a slightly more optimistic reading than this, actually, but it is making a particular academic point. If honeybees ended up evolving the same cognitive capacities that we have, they might actually come to question whether some of their ancestral practices should persist. After all, humans, admittedly on an optimistic reading, have made considerable progress with regard to prohibiting things like slavery, and in many countries to reducing sexism and treating children as having rights now. So we could envisage campaigns among the more enlightened honeybees against the slaughter of conspecifics. There would be marches, there would be demonstrations. Some progressive young queens would start talking about rights for males, etc. Okay, the last and the shorter section of the three things I wanted to say is now focusing specifically on religion. I've argued so far that our capacity for ethical reasoning had its roots in our biological nature, but was then hijacked, as it were, through a sort of bootstrapping. For those of you who know Daniel Dennett's writings, it's cranes in his terminology, as the human mind became increasingly powerful and sought for internal consistency in its reasoning. The result is that at least some humans increasingly have become convinced by the validity of what John Rawls expresses as decision-making behind a veil of ignorance, namely that we should make ethical decisions as if we did not know our own position. It's back to Kant's categorical imperative I mentioned earlier. So, for example, laws about gender should be made by individuals genuinely setting aside, though that's not easy to do, whether they themselves are male, female, or other, and laws about immigration should be made without the presumption that one is or is not a migrant, and so on. In reality, of course, you'd want a more collective system because almost none of us is very good at putting aside self-interest. Now, at first sight, it might be thought that this growth in human understanding about ethics does not fit very well with insights from religion, apart from the most generic religious injunctions to do as one would be done by. After all, most religions are rather ancient in origin and contain something of a mishmash of ethical injunctions and stories of the good in action. However, I think there are reasons for the believer, and I would hold for the unbeliever, why religions may have a major role to play in how we should behave. And the first is because religions manifest themselves in communities. I mentioned earlier that none of us derives our moral beliefs ex nihilo, as it were. So if, for example, a Buddhist of whatever persuasion, consider yourself, make it simple, imagine you are a Buddhist, it's likely, along with other Buddhists, that you will believe that you have a particular commitment to non-violence, that you should eschew craving, that you should demonstrate compassion, and so on. And the internalization and manifestation of such a way of being is helped by the presence of others who share one's beliefs. It's not a coincidence that the word ethics derives from the classical Greek ethos, meaning a custom or a habit. We mostly exercise our behaviors in the presence of others with comparable values, and religions promulgate ethical values that could be, should be, often are, good for communities, not just for individuals. A second reason why religions may have a major role to play in how we should behave is because the world's major religions have developed over long periods of time, and they therefore have gone through a period of refinement much akin to that shared, for example, with the testing and sifting of natural selection. In other words, we have reason to place considerable trust in long-standing institutions that genuinely seek to do good. And this, of course, is one reason why more recent humanist and secular organizations often come up with principles that, as far as ethics are concerned, have considerable similarities to those of religion. So when I read books on humanism, or arguing from a secular or humanistic perspective by Richard Norman or Andrew Copson or Michael Hand, there is much about ethics with which I find myself in agreement. Now, having said all that, which all sounds very sort of, motherhood and apple pie, religions do have at least one pretty major difference from humanist and secular approaches, and that is that religious adherents generally attach more weight to religious teachings, fairly obviously, than do agnostics and atheists. Now, this can be a problem. It can mean that religious believers be convinced of a particular reading of their scriptures or the sayings or teachings of their leaders. And to make an obvious point, much injustice has been meted out in the name of religion because of this. However, religions do actually develop in their teachings, and they do have the capacity to lift us up, to help us do good, and to become new people sometimes in ways that on our own we could not manage. They can help us to turn over a new leaf, to start afresh, to be born again. And this is true whether one believes in a transcendental God or not. Now, for Christians, there are a range of ways of understanding how to use Scripture, the teachings of the Church, and reason to determine what is ethical. But whatever approach is used, the accounts of the life and teaching of Jesus are at the very least important, and for many Christians, they are determinative. So whether you go by Thomas à Kempis' The Imitation of Christ, or more contemporary, though often derided, bumper stickers proclaiming WWJD, what would Jesus do? The notion that the goal of the Christian life is to be conformed to the image of God's Son has scriptural warrant and a long history. Finally, let me point out that this can be seen as a form of virtue ethics, that however much one fails, the Christian is called to model their life on that of Jesus of Nazareth, the risen Christ. Like any virtue ethics, there is the worry that right behavior and action only make sense within the confines of a particular time and place. But basing one's ethics on the one whom Christians see as both the author of the universe and the subject of the New Testament has advantages. And when we consider the problems that arise from human selfishness and other moral failings, there is much in the person and teachings of Jesus and subsequent Christian theology, beginning in the New Testament itself, that can lead to healing and wholeness for individuals, for communities, and for the whole of creation. Thank you.
So Michael has introduced a big theme. What is the relationship between religion, science, and ethics? How do we decide what's morally right and morally wrong? And how might science, and particularly evolutionary biology, contribute to our joint decision-making in an age and society which apparently lacks moral consensus? And indeed, an age where, if not science, then technology is facing us with moral quandaries at dizzying speed. New reproductive technologies, new digital technologies, social media and surveillance equipment, every day something new comes before us. Should we collect the genetic information of an entire populace to benefit research and the health service? How do science and religion help us address these questions? Now, I agree with very much of what Michael has said, and I won't be able to address all of it. I agree substantially with his diagnosis of the present situation and a degree of moral listlessness in our collective society, though perhaps not with his account of where it comes from. For instance, Professor Reiss suggested that for much of human history, the teachings of religion were possibly the sole or principal means by which people decided what was right or wrong. So that in many societies, if people were asked if it's wrong to lie, he said the majority of people in many countries would have said yes, because Scripture forbids it. The reliance on religion, and here it seems to be Western Protestant religion that Michael has in mind, he goes on to say has been challenged in the modern period by the development of in the 19th and 18th century of moral philosophy, and then, more recently, the rapid growth in evolutionary biology with an enthusiastic assumption or presumption that biology could be the source of ethics. I wonder if this is so. I wonder if Professor Reiss has not both overestimated the extent to which even the scripture-based religions derive their ethical framework and guidelines from scriptural admonition, and underestimated the historical autonomy of ethical deliberation. In the Christian West, ethics has long been known to be separable from religion, at least from the kind of religion that turns to Scripture for ready-made answers on right and wrong. Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics antedates Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals by well over 2,000 years, and was known to the medieval church and subsequently influential in all Western political and moral thought. Aristotle and the Stoic antique moralists were concerned with how to live a good life. Gods in Greek philosophy are only incidentally invoked and not as givers of positive moral commands. Although the term ethics, as we use it, is of relatively recent provenance, whenever women and men have argued about the good, the social, and the political life, they have been doing ethics. Christianity, when it grounded the moral consensus of the country in which we live, provided far more, I suggest, than a set of biblical prohibitions or off-the-shelf answers or a mishmash of ethical injunctions and edifying tales, but something much more like a moral compass, a broad network of convictions about the good life based on the teaching of Bibles and, as Michael has said, the life of Christ, and a belief in a creator God who was both good and loving and called human beings to be likewise. These directives were to be followed not simply to avoid punishment, but to be the kind of creatures human beings were meant to be, in the image of God, and oriented to our utmost good, which was the utmost good, which is God. Now, I agree with Michael on this point. Ethics has its origins in biology. How I might want to parse this slightly differently. Ethics is biological in the profoundly basic sense in that it depends on what we are as human animals. For instance, if it took 3 human sexes to reproduce instead of 2, then matrimony would presumably involve 3 people. If we didn't need oxygen to survive, there might be no harm in holding someone's head underwater for 10 minutes in jest. Ethical behavior, the human ethos, is based on what Wittgenstein called forms of life, and some of it is particular to particular cultures, and other things are universal. It's universally considered not cricket to put someone's head underwater for 10 minutes because they will die. Ethics, and I think Michael implied this, goes all the way down. It doesn't just concern contentious matters like perjury and theft, but has its anchorage in the everyday. How do you greet people, thank them, accept a gift? Ethics is a way of life, and any organized society has ethics. It's worth remembering that the earliest name, or one of the earliest names for the Christian movement, was the Way. As such, as the ancient historian Pierre Hadot has argued, with memorable brilliance in his book, Philosophy as a Way of Life, in late antiquity, the Christian way stood amongst a number of other ways known to those who wished to pursue a virtuous life, the way of the Stoics, the Epicureans, and so on. These philosophical schools aimed at the good life for the leisured men, they were mostly men, who had time for it, the study of metaphysics, logic, mathematics, and ethics, all leading to an ordered or good life. So Greece had sophisticated ethical systems, and Christianity, emerging in the Greco-Roman world, took it for granted that all women and men naturally seek the good, and married this with the more distinctively Jewish and Christian teaching that this was to seek God, the source of all good things and of our well-being. Thus, in the Divine Comedy, Dante can make the pagan poet Virgil his guide because Virgil is a good and a just man. And Dante believed, as apparently did St. Paul, that it should be evident to all the world that the world is made by and guided to the good, and that all rightly ordered things, indeed all life, moves towards the good as a sunflower turns towards the sun. This is the basis of what's called eudaimonistic ethics. All things, even sunflowers, seek their good, seek to be happy. What dissolved this? Kant was writing at a time when metaphysics was at low ebb, and as Michael said, atheism and agnosticism, if not fashionable, at least becoming acceptable, though Kant was neither of these. And there were various moral philosophies developed at this time, which were laudable attempts to found a universal grounding for religion that was religion-free, usually not because they were hostile to religion, but because they were concerned about the disputes between the various religious sects. These were laudable but perhaps unsuccessful attempts because ethics, once seen to be grounded in the very order of the cosmos, the very fabric of the universe, and this was true of not just of Christian and Jewish ethics, but of many faith and philosophical tradition, was now reconceived as a matter of a rational calculus, a balancing of outcomes and effects. And I wonder whether it might be precisely this which has made evolutionary biology so attractive to some in modernity as a possible regrounding source of ethical norms. Because here, once again, we seem to hold the promise of an ethics that's grounded in the given being our biological natures. Evolutionary ethics, thus, as Professor Reiss in his wider text suggests, makes sense. But only, I would say, to a point. The difficulty, as he more or less admits, lies in the jump between the scientific account of why the world is as it is, what is there and how it operates, and, on the other hand, how we would wish it to be. That is, between the factual, insofar as we can reach it, and the evaluative, or, more familiarly, between the is and the ought. Evolutionary biology, however successful, can only provide an account of what is the case, but it has proven fairly fragile in determining what ought to be the case, as the 20th century's disastrous experiments in eugenics have demonstrated. As Michael said, there may be biological explanations of music and dance, but people make music and dance because they enjoy doing these things. Evolutionary ethics has some points to make about what's good for the species, but is less forthcoming on what the good is for the individual, which is where some of the religions hold a trump card, I think. So, for example, Peter Singer's expanding circle seems to me to say too little or too much. Either you can just say as an evolutionary biologist, well, this is what's happened, that's too little. But if you go on to say, and this is good, you make an evaluative assessment, and it's expanded in this way to concern wider and wider groups, I think you're expanding beyond the remit of what is provided by science. You're moving into a normative domain. This is a major problem which the philosopher Nagel has been addressing for over the past decade with great seriousness. So Michael suggested, as I've said, that there might be a time when, if asked, is it wrong to lie, the majority of people in many countries would say yes because Scripture forbids it, But I would argue that even within conservative Protestant Christianity, this kind of propositional ethics has been very rare, not least because there's so many questions the New Testament simply doesn't address, like not just surveillance use of drones, it's quite silent on that, but what about banking and money lending standing where we are? It's not a cut and paste type of book. More common than we imagine in the history of religious ethics, as every parent knows, is some form of virtue ethics, as Michael has also indicated, where this is not about a list of prohibitions, rights, and wrongs, but a trained direction of heart and will. Traditional ethical systems of all sorts relied on moral formation. Classically, lying was not considered wrong simply because it was against Scripture or because it hurt other people, but with roots going back to Plato at least, because it damaged the liar themselves. Virtue ethics, with their concern for the formation of whole and just individuals, is a far better way of addressing the challenges of contemporary science and technology, as Michael has suggested, which find no ready answer in scriptural proof texting. Although much can be said of the collapse of ethical systems and so on, it's easy to overlook the overwhelming consensus that makes a society like ours work every day. Children should be loved. Parties and transactions should be honest. The wheels of life and commerce and child-raising wouldn't turn without such basics. What is perhaps lost in modernity, or perhaps in modern Britain and the Anglophone world, maybe the Western world, is any sense of a metaphysical anchorage for the good, an order to the universe to which the good life is ordered. Kant and other Enlightenment rationalists, having rejected metaphysics, sought to establish everything, including ethics, on reason with limited success. A return to a biological grounding is arguably a good way forward because at least it allows our moral framework some way of thinking about our obligations to the rest of the created order. Now, here I've smuggled in a term, a Christian term, created, because for the Christian or the Muslim or the Jew, we are, of course, animals, certainly, with certain biological needs and dispositions, but over this, we are creatures. We are creatures made by a creator. And as creatures, we understand our being and that of all the other creatures and that entire cosmos as an integrated order and as gifts. Christians cannot avoid being at least minimally metaphysical insofar as we believe there's a creator God and that all things, including space and time, have their being from this divine creator. And this is really quite an important aspect of what faith traditions have to give. I mentioned already the philosopher Nagel, who asks in a number of piercing articles recently, he wants to return to the cosmic questions. This is unusual in Nagel, who is an analytic philosopher and who openly says he's not religious and he hopes there isn't a God. But he's triangulating around God all the time now. And he asks, is there a way to live in harmony with the universe and not just in it? That's in an article of his called Secular Philosophy and the Religious Temperament. He says he wants a secular answer to what he calls the cosmic question, which is how can we live not merely the life of the creature one is, but in some sense participate in it, in the life of the universe as a whole. In short, he's searching for this cosmic sense of unity that I think many people, I see it in the undergraduates, feel that we've lost, that our moral life is just scattered about, and there's no sense of anchoring down, deeply down into the good. It's not clear, Nagel goes on to say, that without God, what we could aspire to do in this, what we could aspire to be in harmony with. And he bemoans this. He's sad about this. But it was very interesting that Nagel, too, is smuggling in the word creature, talking about himself as a creature. Well, Thomas Aquinas said that the end of the human being is salus, often translated as salvation, but the Latin suggests health, well-being, human flourishing, a term about which Professor Reiss has written too. Aquinas' ethics, like that of utilitarianism, is eudaimonistic It believes that all people want to be happy. They choose the good because it makes them happy. Unfortunately, they can be misguided in their choices. But this solace, this health, is what we were created for in Aquinas' view, and what should inform this life as well as lead us into the next. Thomas's imaginative integration in his own time of Aristotelian thought introduced a biological grounding to the Christian morality of his day that we may want to try to emulate today. But it remains to be seen if a modern-day Aquinas could marry evolutionary biology with the metaphysics of gift, or how evolutionary biology could show us what it means to be just and loving creatures without any notion of the just and loving Creator to whom we are oriented. Thank you.
Before we conclude this evening's proceedings, I want on behalf of you all to thank both our speakers for very humane and engaging presentations addressing critical and historically expressed concerns. And if I may presume to judge the faces of your audience, I may say you have held them all along this evening. I'm very pleased to be able to announce that next year's Boyle Lecturer will be Christopher Cook, Professor of Spirituality, Theology and Health at Durham University, and a director of the Durham Centre of the same name. He has research doctorates in psychiatry and in theology and is a priest of the Church of England. He's currently a member of one of the thematic groups of the Church's Living in Love and Hope project, destined to report and seemingly decisively on issues of sexuality. The likely subject of his lecture will be mental health and the gospel. The date of the lecture will be announced shortly on our respective websites, indeed as soon as possible. So thank you again for your presence and for your courteous and interested attention this evening.